Hello. Bread, rice, potatoes, ... These are the foods people with diabetes are often told to avoid, but these are major staples in most cuisines. So, good luck with that, because it's not realistic to cut those things out long term. But the truth is, you can eat them safely if you know how. I'm Dr. Lightkim, and I want to show you how to enjoy eating carbohydrates without sending your blood sugar on a roller coaster. I'm going to cover practical, science-based strategies you can start today to flatten those glucose spikes after meals and, in the process, improve your insulin resistance. A quick note: even though I'm a physician, I'm not your physician. So, please talk to your doctor before you make any changes to your diet or medical regimen. Let's start with one of the most powerful but probably least known tools we have for this: resistant starch. Now, most starches like bread, pasta, things made out of flour break down into glucose, and this is what raises your blood sugar pretty quickly. Those repeated blood sugar spikes are what drive worsening insulin resistance and lead to pancreas dysfunction, which ultimately makes diabetes worse. But resistant starch digests and behaves very differently. Your enzymes are just not good at digesting it. So instead of being broken down quickly and spiking your blood glucose, resistant starch travels to the large intestine where your gut bacteria ferment it. That fermentation produces things like short-chain fatty acids, like butyrate, which actually improve your insulin sensitivity, help reduce inflammation, and even feed the cells lining your colon. So how do you get resistant starch? Well, one good trick is to take your typical starchy foods that would normally raise your blood sugar and just cool them and then heat them back up before you eat them. By doing that, you'll increase the food's resistant starch content. You can take bread, pasta, and rice, and when you cool it, part of the starch crystallizes into this resistant form. It's a process called starch retrogradation, where gelatinized starch molecules realign and form crystalline structures that basically resist digestion in your small intestine. So you can still eat your favorite foods, but just cool them and heat them up later to enjoy the metabolic benefits. Multiple studies show that cooling cooked rice or potatoes down to around 39 degrees Fahrenheit for 24 hours significantly increases resistant starch content compared to freshly cooked starches. And clinically, eating cooled and then reheated rice or potatoes does lead to reduced post-meal glucose and insulin spikes. So, if you're eating at home, you do not have to give up bread, rice, or potatoes. Just cool it or freeze it first and then reheat it. It may not taste exactly the same, but it's going to be pretty close, and the benefits are very hard to ignore. Plus, many other foods are naturally high in resistant starch that you can just add to your regimen. Those would be things like beans, lentils, peas, and whole grains like oats and barley. Okay, the next principle is food pairing. With carbs, we rarely eat them in isolation. And what you eat alongside your carbs can dramatically change your glucose response. A meta-analysis of 154 trials showed that just adding protein to a carbohydrate meal can reduce the glucose area under the curve by up to 50% in healthy adults. We also have evidence that fat can blunt early glucose spikes because fat helps delay gastric emptying and can help with insulin clearance, all of which eventually improves your pancreatic beta cell function. That's why, ideally, we don't want to eat starchy or processed carbohydrates in isolation. Some people call this avoiding naked carbs. And that's why rice and beans is usually better than just rice alone. Or potatoes with butter or olive oil usually produces a gentler glucose spike compared to just eating potatoes alone. Another thing we can do is add acid to our meals. So that would be things like vinegar, lemon, or lime. Many fermented foods can help with that. What they do is lower the rate at which starch is broken down. Vinegar can also help with insulin sensitivity in your muscles and can actually blunt glucose spikes all on its own by working on your liver's glucose production. I actually made a separate video on all the benefits of apple cider vinegar and how to use it, and I'll post a link to that in the description below. By the way, another way you can supercharge your food pairing is by eating your carbohydrates last. Food order actually matters here. If you start your meal with bread or juice, you'll just get a sharp glucose peak. But if you eat your protein and your vegetables first, and then finish with carbs, the stomach releases a slower mix of glucose into the intestines. So, we end up absorbing that glucose much more slowly. And the beauty is, it's the exact same food, but if you eat it in a different order, that will give you a completely different glucose curve. This is especially important in restaurants where they like to give you bread or nachos before bringing out your salad or main entree. Eat your salad and your protein first, and then go for the bread or the nachos. It's a very small behavioral change, but it pays off huge metabolic dividends. Multiple clinical studies show exactly that. One randomized control crossover trial showed that people with type 2 diabetes who ate their protein and vegetables before their carbohydrates had a 40% lower glucose area under the curve and a 31% lower insulin area under the curve. A recent study in Japan used continuous glucose monitors in healthy adults and showed that eating rice last significantly reduced post-meal glycemic excursions. Now, another thing that can make a big difference is walking right after a meal. We have studies, like a randomized control trial, that show just a 10-minute walk immediately after a meal can lower your post-meal glucose. It doesn't have to be walking. Any kind of light activity, like cleaning up in the kitchen or climbing stairs, can make a difference. But walking has been the most studied and it's probably the easiest for most people to do. You just have to remember that the best time to walk or exercise is as soon as possible after a meal. The reason walking after eating is so powerful is because walking activates your soleus muscles. The soleus is that muscle in your calf that runs just below the knee to the heel. And the soleus muscle is a metabolic powerhouse because it can soak up a lot of glucose very quickly. Another thing that makes this muscle so special is the fact that it's composed of slot-rich fibers, which allows it to sustain contractions for long periods of time without fatiguing. So, you're burning lots of glucose for a long period of time before your muscle gets tired. Okay, next, a lot of people will tell you to just cut out all carbs to reverse your diabetes and fix your insulin resistance. But it's really not the carbs per se, it's the type of carbs that cause the issues. Not all carbs are created equal. The way these carbs are processed is what determines how fast they're absorbed and hit your bloodstream. So, flour milled into a fine powder, like in white bread or instant oats, digests extremely quickly. But whole grains or coarser grains digest much slower and don't cause the same issues. Think of it like kindling versus logs in a fire. Fine flour, what you see in white bread, cereal, pastries, or chipstats, like throwing sawdust into the fire. It burns fast and hot. On the flip side, you have your steel-cut oats, intact grains, or high-fiber carbohydrates. Now, they burn more like logs, slower and more evenly. And for your body, that just means smaller, steadier glucose curves, instead of those sharp spikes and crashes. So, just like with resistant starches, choose carbohydrates that are made from whole foods, foods that are minimally processed and high in fiber. Fiber is probably the most important carbohydrate that you do not want to miss if you choose to do a low-carb diet. For most people, the benefits of extra fiber are huge and just too hard to ignore. And one last tip, do not eat late at night. The later you eat, the worse your glucose response. We have numerous studies that show eating close to bedtime worsens your ability to process glucose, even if you don't eat a carb-heavy meal. That's because physiologically, our insulin sensitivity and our pancreas' ability to secrete insulin all follow a circadian rhythm where we just can't process glucose as well in the evening as we do earlier in the day. What makes this worse is that late at night is when we get elevated levels of endogenous melatonin, which actually further reduces insulin secretion. So, less insulin means more glucose in our bloodstream. The earlier you eat your dinner, the better. I would recommend eating your last meal for the day, ideally at least 3 hours before bedtime. Alright, I hope this was helpful. Stay healthy, and I'll see you in the next one.